The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and orange as Captain Sarah Martinez walked across the dusty airfield toward her aircraft. Her flight suit was already damp with sweat even though the day had barely begun. The desert heat would be unbearable by noon, but right now the air felt crisp and clean. Sarah had been flying combat missions for 8 months now. She was part of the 354th Fighter Squadron stationed at Bagram Airfield. Her fellow pilots called her Lightning because of her quick reflexes and deadly accurate shooting. She had earned that nickname the hard way through countless missions over the dangerous terrain of Afghanistan. Today felt different somehow. Sarah could not put her finger on what made this morning special, but something in the air made her more alert than usual. She had learned to trust her instincts during her time in combat. Those same instincts had kept her alive through more than 200 combat sorties. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat waiting on the flight line like a sleeping giant. The aircraft looked worn and battle-tested with patches covering bullet holes from previous missions. The twin engines hung beneath the wings like massive pods. The nose stretched forward, ending in the business end of a 30mm cannon that could tear apart enemy vehicles with ease. Sarah ran her hand along the fuselage as she completed her pre-flight inspection. The metal felt warm under her palm. This was not just any aircraft. This was tail number A-965, the same A-10 her father had flown during the Gulf War 21 years ago. Colonel James Martinez had been shot down in this very aircraft back in 1991. He spent 3 terrifying days behind enemy lines before rescue teams found him. The A-10 had brought him home safely despite taking heavy damage from enemy fire. When Sarah learned that 81 or 965 was still in active service, she had specifically requested to fly it. Flying her father's old aircraft made her feel connected to him even though he was thousands of miles away back home in Texas. Every time she climbed into the cockpit, she could almost feel his presence beside her. The control stick had been worn smooth by his hands and countless other pilots who had flown this sturdy machine. Sarah climbed up the ladder and settled into the ejection seat. The cockpit felt like a second home after so many months of flying combat missions. She knew the location of every switch and button without looking. Her fingers moved automatically through the startup checklist as the engines began their familiar whine. The mission briefing had been routine that morning. Intelligence reports indicated that a supply convoy was moving through the Korengal Valley. The mountain pass was known for Taliban ambushes. Sarah's job was to provide air cover and eliminate any threats to the American soldiers below. She had flown escort missions through this same valley dozens of times before. The narrow mountain pass wound between steep rocky walls that provided perfect hiding spots for enemy fighters. Taliban forces liked to position themselves on the high ridges where they could fire down at passing convoys. Ground control gave Sarah clearance for takeoff. She pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the twin turbofan engines responded. The A-10 rolled down the runway, picking up speed until the wings finally grabbed enough air to lift the heavy aircraft into the morning sky. The mountains below looked peaceful from 10,000 feet. Deep valleys cut between towering peaks that stretched as far as the eye could see. Snow still capped the highest mountains even in the summer heat. It was hard to believe that such beautiful terrain could hide so much danger. Sarah contacted the ground controller as she approached the target area. The convoy was right on schedule, moving slowly through the narrow pass. 20 vehicles carrying supplies and ammunition for the forward operating base. 60 American soldiers depending on her to keep them safe. The radio crackled to life with urgent voices. The convoy commander reported movement on the ridges above the pass. Muzzle flashes sparkled like deadly stars as Taliban fighters opened fire with automatic weapons. The sound of gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, mixing with the roar of diesel engines and shouting voices. Sarah could see the ambush unfolding below her. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves perfectly along both sides of the pass. The convoy was trapped in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to run. Soldiers were returning fire while trying to find cover behind their vehicles. Without hesitation, Sarah rolled her A-10 into a steep diving attack. The aircraft responded like a trained warhorse eager for battle. She lined up her first target, a group of Taliban fighters, firing from behind a cluster of large rocks. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon. The 30mm gun erupted with a sound like thunder mixed with the roar of a chainsaw. Bright tracers streaked toward the target as the 7-barrel cannon fired at an incredible rate. The rocky outcrop disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris. The enemy gunfire from that position stopped immediately. Sarah pulled out of her dive and circled back for another attack run. More muzzle flashes appeared from different positions along the ridge. The Taliban fighters were well hidden and disciplined. They knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. She lined up another target and squeezed the trigger again. The cannon shells found their mark with devastating accuracy. Years of training and months of combat experience had turned Sarah into a deadly precise pilot. Each burst from her gun eliminated another threat to the convoy below. The battle continued for 20 minutes as Sarah systematically hunted down each enemy position. The Taliban fighters tried to retreat, but the rocky terrain that had hidden them now trapped them. There was nowhere to run from the deadly accurate fire of the A-10. Just as the last enemy position fell silent, everything went wrong in the span of a single heartbeat. Sarah was pulling out of another attack run when she saw the bright flash of a shoulder-fired missile streaking up toward her aircraft. The explosion hit her left engine with tremendous force. The entire A-10 shuddered and bucked like an angry bull. Warning lights flooded the cockpit in a cascade of red and amber. The master caution alarm began its insistent beeping as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Oil pressure dropped to 0 on the left engine. Hydraulic pressure gauges showed critical low readings. Thick black smoke began pouring into the cockpit, making it hard to breathe. The acrid smell of burning oil and electrical components filled her nostrils. Sarah fought to maintain control as her aircraft began its violent descent toward the unforgiving Afghan mountains below. The same peaks that had looked so beautiful just minutes ago now appeared as jagged teeth, waiting to devour her and her father's faithful A-10. The control stick felt sluggish in her hands. The aircraft was dying, and there was nothing she could do to save it. The A-10 was falling like a stone toward the Rocky Mountains below. Sarah's hands gripped the control stick so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The aircraft was shaking violently as pieces of the damaged left engine broke away and tumbled through the air behind her. Warning alarms filled the cockpit with their urgent sounds. Red lights blinked on the instrument panel like angry eyes. The smell of burning oil and melting wires made it hard for Sarah to breathe. She had to make a decision fast, or she would die along with her aircraft. Sarah tried to level the wings and gain some control over the dying machine. The right engine was still running, but it could not provide enough power to keep the heavy A-10 in the air. The aircraft was losing altitude at an alarming rate. She had perhaps 2 minutes before complete engine failure would force her to abandon the aircraft. The mountainous terrain below offered no safe landing options. Jagged peaks stretched in every direction. Deep valleys cut between the mountains like scars in the earth. There were no flat areas where she could attempt an emergency landing. Even if she could find a level spot, the A-10 was too badly damaged to survive any kind of controlled crash. Sarah's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to nurse the aircraft toward the nearest friendly base, but that was more than 50 miles away. The damaged A-10 would never make it that far. The right engine was already showing signs of stress from carrying the full load alone. She could try to reach a flat area in the valley below, but the Taliban fighters were still down there somewhere. Landing in enemy territory would mean certain capture or death. The militants did not take prisoners, especially not female American pilots who had just killed several of their fighters. The hardest part of her decision was not about her own safety. Sarah was thinking about the aircraft itself. This was not just any A-10 Thunderbolt. This was tail number 810965, the same aircraft that had carried her father through the dangers of the Gulf War 21 years earlier. Colonel James Martinez had been shot down in this very aircraft back in 1991. Enemy fire had damaged both engines and knocked out most of the electrical systems. He had managed to fly the crippled again for almost 30 minutes before finally being forced to eject over the Iraqi desert. The A-10 had crashed and burned, but it had carried her father far enough from the battle zone to give him a chance at survival. He spent 3 days hiding in the desert before American rescue teams found him. The aircraft had saved his life by staying in the air just long enough to reach a safer area. When Sarah learned that 810965 had been repaired and returned to service, she had made a special request. She wanted to fly the same aircraft that had brought her father home safely. It was her way of honoring his memory and staying connected to the family tradition of military service. Now she was facing the same impossible choice her father had confronted 2 decades earlier. The difference was that Colonel Martinez had ejected over relatively flat desert terrain. Sarah was looking at jagged mountain peaks and deep rocky valleys that could easily hide her parachute from rescue teams. The irony was almost too much to bear. Like her father before her, she was about to abandon the same faithful aircraft that had served their family with honor. The A-10 had survived the Gulf War and countless missions in Afghanistan only to meet its end in these hostile mountains. Sarah grabbed the radio handset with one hand while fighting to control the aircraft with the other. She needed to contact the Rescue Coordination Center and report her situation. The sooner search teams knew her location, the better her chances of survival would be. Static filled her headphones as she tried to establish radio contact. The electrical damage from the missile hit was affecting her communication systems. Finally, she heard the voice of the rescue controller through the crackling interference. Sarah reported her position and aircraft status in calm, professional tones, despite the chaos around her. Years of training had taught her to remain composed even in the most desperate situations. The rescue controller confirmed that search teams were already being dispatched to her area. The left engine finally seized completely with a grinding metallic scream. Black smoke poured from the damaged nacelle as pieces of hot metal scattered in the slipstream. The A-10 rolled to the left and began an uncontrolled spiral toward the mountains. Sarah fought to regain control, but the hydraulic systems were failing. The flight controls felt mushy and unresponsive in her hands. She was rapidly running out of time and options. The mountain peaks were rushing up toward her with frightening speed. She thought about her father in that moment. Colonel Martinez had faced this same terror 21 years ago. He had wrestled with the same impossible decision while his aircraft fell apart around him. The difference was that he had lived to tell his story and inspire his daughter to follow in his footsteps. Sarah made her choice. She would not let fear control her final moments in the aircraft that meant so much to her family. She would fly 810965 as far as possible toward friendly territory, just like her father had done. Every extra mile might mean the difference between rescue and capture. The right engine was overheating badly now. Temperature gauges showed readings far into the red zone. Sarah knew it was only a matter of minutes before the second engine failed completely. When that happened, she would have no choice but to eject from the dying aircraft. She spotted a narrow valley that seemed to lead away from the immediate battle area. Taliban fighters would be focused on the convoy and the crash site. If she could reach the valley before ejecting, her chances of avoiding capture would improve significantly. Sarah pointed the nose of the A-10 toward the valley entrance. The aircraft responded sluggishly to her control inputs. Metal groaned and structural components began to fail under the stress of uncontrolled flight. Warning lights covered every surface of the instrument panel. The right engine temperature climbed past the maximum safe operating limit. Sarah could hear changes in the engine sound that warned of imminent failure. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the power plant would destroy itself and leave her with no thrust at all. Her hand moved to the ejection seat controls. The yellow and black striped handles seemed to glow in the red lighting of the damaged cockpit. Once she pulled those handles, there would be no going back. The Martin Baker ejection seat would blast her clear of the aircraft in less than 2 seconds. Sarah's last act before ejecting was to transmit her final position report. She wanted rescue teams to know exactly where to look for her. More importantly, she wanted them to know the tail number of the aircraft she was about to abandon. With tears in her eyes, Sarah pulled both ejection handles simultaneously. The explosive charges fired and rocketed her clear of the aircraft, just as the right engine exploded in a ball of orange flame. The ejection seat fired Sarah high into the Afghan sky like a rocket. The explosive charge hit her body with tremendous force, driving the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred as massive G-forces pressed down on her chest and shoulders. The world spun in a dizzy whirl of blue sky and brown mountains. Below her, the A-10 continued its death spiral toward the rocky peaks. Sarah watched helplessly as her father's aircraft smashed into the mountainside in a tremendous explosion of orange flame and black smoke. Pieces of metal scattered across the rocks like deadly confetti. The faithful machine that had served 2 generations of her family was gone forever. Sarah's parachute deployed automatically with a sharp jerk that sent waves of pain through her injured body. The ejection had dislocated her left shoulder and twisted her right ankle badly. Every movement sent sharp bolts of agony through her battered frame. But she was alive and falling slowly toward the hostile terrain below. The parachute ride seemed to last forever as Sarah drifted down toward the rocky valley floor. She could see Taliban fighters already moving toward the crash site of her A-10, the smoke column from the burning. Aircraft rose high into the clear mountain air like a signal beacon calling. Every enemy fighter in the area. Sarah tried to steer her, parachute away from the crash site, but the winds were pushing her in the wrong direction. She was going to land less than half a mile from where her aircraft had hit the ground. The Taliban fighters would spot her parachute easily and begin hunting for her within minutes. The landing was harder than she expected. Sarah hit the rocky ground with bone-jarring impact that sent fresh waves of pain through her injured shoulder. The parachute dragged her across sharp stones for several yards before she managed to hit the release catches. Her flight suit was torn and bloody from the rough landing. Sarah quickly gathered the parachute silk and stuffed it behind a large boulder. The white fabric would be visible from miles away if she left it in the open. She checked her survival kit and found that most of her equipment had survived the ejection. Her survival radio was cracked but still working. She had 3 bottles of water and enough food bars for 2 days. The sound of voices echoing off the canyon walls made Sarah freeze in terror. Taliban fighters were already searching the area around the crash site. They were calling to each other in a language she did not understand, but their intent was clear. They were hunting for the American pilot who had just killed several of their comrades. Sarah forced herself to move despite the pain in her shoulder and ankle. She had to find a hiding place before the enemy searchers expanded their sweep pattern to include her landing area. The rocky terrain offered many potential hiding spots, but she needed to choose carefully. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah made her way deeper into the valley. Every step sent sharp pains through her twisted ankle. Her dislocated shoulder made it almost impossible to use her left arm. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool mountain air. The thin atmosphere at high altitude made every breath a struggle. She found a narrow crack between 2 large boulders that offered good concealment. Sarah squeezed into the tight space and tried to make herself as small as possible. From her hiding spot, she could see the crash site where thick black smoke still rose from the burning wreckage of her A-10. Taliban fighters swarmed over the crash area like angry ants. They were picking through the debris and taking photographs with cell phone cameras. Sarah knew they would use pictures of the destroyed American aircraft for propaganda purposes. The thought made her sick to her stomach. The enemy searchers began expanding their hunt pattern just as Sarah had feared. Groups of 3 or 4 fighters spread out across the valley floor, checking every possible hiding place. They moved with the patience of experienced hunters who knew their prey could not escape the mountain valley. Sarah tried to contact rescue forces on her survival radio, but the signal was too weak to reach friendly units. The mountains blocked most radio transmissions, and her damaged equipment was not powerful enough to punch through the interference. She was completely cut off from outside help. Night fell quickly in the mountains as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. The temperature dropped rapidly from the blazing heat of day to the bitter cold of high-altitude darkness. Sarah's torn flight suit provided little protection against the freezing mountain air. The Taliban fighters continued their search using flashlights and battery-powered lanterns. Sarah could see the dancing beams of light moving across the valley floor like deadly fireflies. Several times the searchers passed within yards of her hiding place. She held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the crack between the rocks. On the second day, Sarah's water began to run low. The high altitude and dry mountain air made her desperately thirsty. She found a small stream running between the rocks, but the water looked dirty and contaminated. Drinking it might make her sick, but she had no choice if she wanted to survive. The muddy stream water tasted terrible and made Sarah violently ill within hours. She spent most of the second night vomiting behind her boulder hiding place. The noise worried her because sound carried far in the thin mountain air. Enemy fighters might hear her retching and investigate the source. Taliban search parties continued to comb the valley with systematic thoroughness. They had brought in additional fighters from other areas and were conducting a professional military-style sweep. Sarah realized they would eventually find her if she stayed in the same hiding place much longer. On the second night, Sarah made the dangerous decision to move to a different location. Her ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and every step was agony. Her dislocated shoulder had stiffened to the point where she could barely move her left arm, but staying put meant certain capture. Moving only during the darkest hours before dawn, Sarah crawled and limped to a new hiding spot further up the valley slope. The climb was exhausting in her injured condition, but it took her away from the main search area. Her new hiding place was a shallow cave carved into the rock face by centuries of wind and water erosion. From her elevated position, Sarah could see the entire valley spread out below her. Taliban fighters were still searching, but their efforts seemed less organized on the third day. Some of the search parties had given up and returned to their main camps. Others continued the hunt with the stubborn persistence of men who refused to admit defeat. Sarah's survival radio finally picked up a weak signal from American rescue forces on the third morning. Her voice was barely a whisper as she reported her position coordinates. The rescue controller acknowledged her transmission and confirmed that help was on the way, but Sarah would have to survive at least one more day in the hostile mountains. As the sun climbed higher into the clear blue sky, Sarah heard a sound that made her heart race with hope and fear. The distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter rotors was echoing off the canyon walls. Rescue was coming, but the Taliban fighters had heard the helicopters too, and were preparing for battle. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as they flew up the narrow mountain valley. Sarah pressed herself deeper into her rocky hiding place and watched the drama unfold below her. Taliban fighters were scrambling to get into position along the ridges where they could fire down at the rescue aircraft. 2 helicopters appeared around the bend in the valley, flying low and fast. The lead aircraft was a UH-60 Blackhawk painted in desert camouflage colors. Its door gunners were already scanning the rocky terrain through the sights of their mounted machine guns. The second helicopter hung back, providing cover and watching for enemy fighters. Sarah tried to signal the helicopters with her survival mirror, but the aircraft were too far away to see the tiny flashes of reflected sunlight. She grabbed her survival radio and transmitted her exact position coordinates one more time. Her voice was hoarse and barely audible after 3 days without proper water. The lead helicopter pilot was Chief Warrant Officer Mike Torres. He had flown more than 300 combat rescue missions during his career in Afghanistan and Iraq. Torres was known throughout the rescue community as one of the best pilots in the business. His calm voice came through the radio static as he acknowledged Sarah's position report. Torres faced an almost impossible challenge. Sarah was hiding on a narrow ledge halfway up the valley wall. The rocky terrain made it dangerous to land a helicopter anywhere near her position. Taliban fighters were positioned on the high ridges, where they had clear fields of fire at any aircraft trying to reach the downed pilot. The Taliban fighters opened fire as soon as the helicopters came within range. Muzzle flashes sparkled from a dozen different positions along the valley walls. Automatic weapons fire echoed off the rocks, mixing with the roar of helicopter rotors. Tracer rounds streaked through the air like deadly fireworks. Torres flew his Blackhawk directly into the storm of enemy gunfire. His door gunners returned fire with their heavy machine guns, sending streams of bullets at the Taliban positions. The second helicopter circled overhead, covering fire and watching for additional threats. Sarah watched in amazement as the lead helicopter threaded its way through the narrow canyon while under constant enemy fire. Torres had to avoid both the rocky walls and the deadly crossfire from Taliban fighters hidden in the rocks. The skill required to fly such a mission was almost beyond human ability. The helicopter reached Sarah's position, but there was no place to land on the narrow, rocky ledge. Torres hovered the Blackhawk just a few feet away from the cliff face while his crew chief prepared to lower a rescue harness. The rotor wash from the main blade sent clouds of dust and debris swirling through the air. Taliban fighters concentrated their fire on the hovering helicopter. Bullets sparked off the armored hull and shattered the side windows. One round punched through the cabin wall just inches from the crew chief's head. The aircraft shuddered under the impact of multiple hits, but Torres held it steady in position. Sarah crawled out of her hiding place and reached for the rescue harness with her good arm. Her injured shoulder screamed in pain as she tried to lift herself up to grab the dangling strap. 3 days of dehydration and injury had left her almost too weak to help with her own rescue. The crew chief saw that Sarah could not reach the harness on her own. Without hesitation, he rappelled down from the helicopter on a fast rope. The young airman landed on the narrow ledge beside Sarah, just as enemy bullets chipped fragments from the rock wall around them. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez had performed dozens of rescue operations, but this was the most dangerous he had ever attempted.
He quickly strapped Sarah into the rescue harness and signaled for the helicopter to lift them both to safety.
Taliban bullets whined past their heads as they rose toward the waiting aircraft. Rodriguez and Sarah swung wildly in the rotor wash as Torres pulled the helicopter away from the cliff face. More enemy fire erupted from hidden positions, but the door gunners suppressed most of the threats with accurate return fire. Within seconds, both the rescuer and the rescued were safely inside the Blackhawk cabin. Sarah was barely conscious as the medical crew began treating her injuries. 3 days of exposure, dehydration, and stress had pushed her body to its absolute limits. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her injured shoulder had swollen to grotesque proportions, but she was alive and in friendly hands. As the helicopter climbed out of the deadly valley, Sarah managed to whisper the coordinates of her crashed A-10 to the crew chief. The military would want to examine the wreckage and recover any sensitive equipment that might have survived the crash. More importantly, they needed to prevent Taliban fighters from using pieces of the aircraft for propaganda purposes. Torres radioed ahead to the medical team at Bagram Airfield as they raced across the Afghan countryside. Sarah needed immediate treatment for dehydration and her injuries. The flight medic started an IV line to replace the fluids her body desperately needed. Painkillers helped ease the agony from her dislocated shoulder. During the flight back to base, something remarkable happened that would make this rescue legendary among military aviators. As Torres helped transfer Sarah from the helicopter to the waiting ambulance, he noticed her name tape sewn above her right breast pocket. The name Martinez made him stop and stare in amazement. 23 years earlier, Torres had been a young crew chief working on the flight line during the Gulf War. He remembered preparing A-10 aircraft for combat missions, including the daily pre-flight inspections on tail number 810965. That aircraft had been flown by Colonel James Martinez, who was shot down and rescued after 3 days behind enemy lines. Torres realized he had just rescued the daughter of the same pilot whose aircraft he had maintained more than 2 decades ago. The same A-10 that had carried Colonel Martinez to safety in 1991 had just been destroyed carrying his daughter on a similar mission. The coincidence was almost too incredible to believe. The medical team rushed Sarah into the emergency room where doctors began treating her injuries. She had a severely dislocated shoulder, a badly sprained ankle, and dangerous levels of dehydration. But her survival training and sheer determination had kept her alive through 3 days of hell in the Afghan mountains. News of the dramatic rescue spread quickly through the military community. The story of Sarah Martinez flying her father's old A-10 and surviving behind enemy lines captured the imagination of pilots and ground crews throughout the war zone. But there was still one more chapter to be written in the saga of tail number 0965 intelligence. Reports confirmed that Taliban fighters were using pieces of the crashed A-10 for propaganda purposes. High-resolution satellite photos showed enemy fighters posing with sections of the aircraft wreckage. The decision was made to launch an airstrike to destroy the remains and deny their use to enemy forces. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons were assigned the E mission to obliterate what was left of Sarah's A-10. The pilots received their target coordinates and aircraft identification number during the mission briefing. Neither pilot realized they were about to destroy the most famous A-10 in their squadron's history. 6 months had passed since Sarah's dramatic rescue from the Afghan mountains. She was back at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, going through physical therapy for her injured shoulder. The doctor said she would be able to return to flying status within another month. Her dream of getting back in the cockpit kept her motivated through the painful rehabilitation process. The official investigation into her shoot-down had been completed weeks earlier. Military analysts had studied every detail of the mission from the initial convoy escort to the final rescue operation. Sarah's experience provided valuable lessons that would help train future combat pilots facing similar situations. The crashed remains of A-10 tail number 810965 had been written off as a total combat loss. The aircraft was listed in official records as destroyed by enemy fire during combat operations in Afghanistan. Sarah tried not to think about the loss of her father's old aircraft, but the pain was still fresh in her heart. Meanwhile, halfway around the world in Afghanistan, intelligence analysts were reviewing routine satellite surveillance photographs. The images showed Taliban fighters continuing to use the crash site for propaganda purposes. Enemy militants were posing for photographs with pieces of the destroyed American aircraft. High-resolution cameras captured detailed images of Taliban fighters holding up sections of the A-10's wings and fuselage. The wreckage had become a symbol of enemy success against American air power. Recruitment videos showed young fighters climbing on the twisted metal remains while waving Taliban flags. The decision came down from higher command levels. The wreckage of Sarah's A-10 had to be destroyed to prevent its continued use for enemy propaganda. An airstrike would be conducted to obliterate every piece of metal that remained from the crash site. 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 34th Fighter Squadron were assigned the destruction mission. The pilots would carry GPS-guided bombs designed to completely eliminate the target. Nothing would remain of the historic A-10 after the precision strike was completed. Captain Jennifer Walsh climbed into her F-16 on a clear morning in October. She was a third-generation Air Force pilot whose family had served in every major conflict since World War II. Her grandfather had flown P-51 Mustangs over Germany. Her father had piloted F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. Jennifer's wingman for the mission was Captain David Chen. He was known throughout the squadron as a student of military aviation history. Chen had written his senior thesis at the Air Force Academy about famous rescue operations during the Gulf War. His research had focused on pilots who survived being shot down behind enemy lines. The 2 F-16 pilots received their mission briefing in the Squadron Operations Center. Intelligence officers provided detailed photographs of the target area and the surrounding terrain. The crashed A-10 wreckage was scattered across a rocky slope in a narrow mountain valley. The briefing officer read through the standard target information, including the GPS, coordinates, and the type of ordnance to be used. Then he mentioned the aircraft identification number of the target they would be destroying. The tail number was 810965. Both F-16 pilots froze when they heard those numbers. Jennifer Walsh felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Captain Chen dropped his pencil and stared at the briefing officer in shock. They both knew that tail number better than any other aircraft in Air Force history. Jennifer Walsh was Colonel James Martinez's niece. She had grown up hearing stories about her uncle's survival behind enemy lines during the Gulf War. The tale of how A-10 tail number 810965 had carried him to safety before crashing in the Iraqi desert was family legend. Captain Chen knew the aircraft number from his extensive research into Gulf War rescue operations. He had interviewed Colonel Martinez personally while writing his academy thesis. The story of the A-10 that saved the colonel's life had been the centerpiece of Chen's academic work. Both pilots realized they were being asked to destroy the most famous A-10 in their squadron's history. The aircraft that had served 2 generations of the Martinez family was about to meet its final end. The irony was almost too much to comprehend. Jennifer struggled to maintain her composure during the rest of the briefing. She wanted to tell the briefing officer about her family connection to the target aircraft, but military professionalism prevented her from speaking up. The mission had been ordered by higher command and would be completed as directed. After the briefing, Jennifer and David walked to their aircraft in stunned silence. Both pilots were thinking about the weight of what they were about to do. They would be the ones to write the final chapter in the story of tail number 810965. The flight to Afghanistan took several hours with multiple air refueling stops along the way. Jennifer and David flew in tight formation across the Middle East toward the target coordinates. Neither pilot spoke much during the long flight. Both were lost in their own thoughts about the mission ahead. As they approached the target area, the forward air controller provided final guidance to the crash site. The Taliban fighters had abandoned the location after intelligence reports suggested an airstrike was coming. The wreckage lay scattered across the mountainside like the bones of some prehistoric creature. Jennifer could see pieces of the A-10 glinting in the afternoon sunlight. Sections of wing and fuselage were spread across hundreds of yards of rocky terrain. The twin engines had separated from the aircraft during the crash and lay buried in a small ravine. The forward air controller cleared both F-16 pilots to release their weapons. Jennifer lined up for her bomb run first while David provided overhead cover. Her GPS-guided bomb would strike the largest section of wreckage. Chen's weapon would target the scattered debris field. Jennifer's finger hovered over the weapon release button as she approached the target. 23 years after carrying her uncle to safety, the faithful A-10 was about to be completely destroyed. The aircraft that had saved Colonel Martinez and his daughter Sarah would finally be laid to rest. The bomb fell away from Jennifer's F-16 with a metallic clunk. Seconds later, David released his weapon as well. Both pilots pulled up and circled back to observe the results of their attack. The explosion sent up massive columns of smoke and debris that could be seen for miles. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained of A-10 tail number 810965. The Aircraft that had served with honor through 2 major wars was gone forever. Its final mission had been to deny enemy forces the propaganda value of American military hardware. That evening, Jennifer called her cousin Sarah at Nellis Air Force Base. Through tears, she explained what had happened during the mission. Sarah thanked her for ensuring that their family's aircraft would never be used to harm American soldiers. The tail number 81-0965 was officially retired from the Air Force inventory. No other aircraft would ever carry those numbers again. Sarah Martinez returned to flight status 2 months later, flying a brand new A-10 with fresh paint and her father's old call sign, Thunder, painted beneath the canopy. The story of the Martinez family and their connection to tail number 81-0965 became legend within the Air Force community. Flight instructors use their story to teach young pilots about honor duty and the bonds that connect military families across generations. Sarah continues to fly combat missions today, carrying forward a tradition of service that spans more than 30 years. She knows that somewhere in the clear blue sky, her father's spirit flies alongside her, watching over his daughter, as she serves her country with the same courage and dedication he showed so many years ago. 2 years after the destruction of tail number 81-0965, Sarah Martinez stood in front of a classroom full of young Air Force Academy cadets. She was now a major and had been selected to teach survival and evasion techniques to the next generation of military pilots. Her own experience behind enemy lines made her the perfect instructor for this critical subject. The cadets sat in perfect silence as Sarah began her lecture. She did not start with technical manuals or classroom theory. Instead, she told them the story of an A-10 Thunderbolt that had served 2 generations of her family. The young faces in front of her hung on every word as she described her father's Gulf War mission and her own shoot-down in Afghanistan. Major Martinez used her family's story to teach important lessons about survival psychology and decision-making under extreme stress. She explained how proper training and mental preparation had kept both her and her father alive during their respective ordeals behind enemy lines. The cadets took detailed notes, knowing they might face similar situations in their own military careers. After the classroom session, several cadets approached Sarah with questions about her experience. They wanted to know more details about the rescue operation and how she had managed to evade capture for 3 days. Sarah answered their questions, patiently knowing that sharing knowledge could save lives in future conflicts. One cadet named Michael Thompson raised his hand during the question period. He was a third-year student majoring in aeronautical engineering with plans to become a fighter pilot after graduation. His question surprised Sarah and made her think about things she had not considered before. Thompson asked what had happened to the other A-10 aircraft that had been built at the same time as tail number 81-0965. He wanted to know if any of those aircraft were still flying combat missions around the world. Sarah admitted she had never researched the history of her father's aircraft beyond her own family's connection to it. That evening, Sarah began researching the production history of A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft manufactured in the early 1980s. She discovered that tail number 81-0965 had been part of a batch of 50 aircraft delivered to the Air Force in 1981. Many of those aircraft were still in active service at bases around the world. Sarah's research led her to discover something remarkable about the A-10 production line. Aircraft 81-0966 had been built immediately after her father's plane on the same assembly line. The 2 aircraft had rolled out of the Fairchild Republic factory just days apart and had served together in the same squadron during the Gulf War. Further investigation revealed that 81-0966 was currently stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The aircraft was assigned to the 354th Fighter Squadron, the same unit Sarah had served with in Afghanistan. More incredibly, the aircraft was scheduled to be retired from service within the next 6 months. Sarah made a formal request to her commanding officers, asking for permission to fly tail number 81-0966 before it was sent to the aircraft boneyard. She explained the historical connection between the 2 aircraft and her family's military service. Her request was approved by the wing commander, who understood the significance of the situation. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing on the flight line at Davis-Monthan, looking up at A-10 tail number 81-0966. The aircraft looked almost identical to her father's old plane except for normal wear and tear from 30 years of military service. The same twin engines hung beneath swept wings. The same deadly cannon protruded from the nose. The crew chief, assigned to 810966, was Technical Sergeant Maria Gonzalez. She had been maintaining A-10 aircraft for 15 years and took great pride in keeping the old warbirds flying. Gonzalez was honored to prepare the historic aircraft for Major Martinez's flight and spent extra time ensuring everything was perfect. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with unusual care and attention to detail. Every rivet and panel reminded her of the aircraft she had lost in Afghanistan. Climbing into the cockpit felt like stepping back in time to her last mission with tail number 810965. The familiar layout of switches and instruments brought back powerful memories. The flight lasted 2 hours as Sarah took 810966 through a series of practice maneuvers over the Arizona desert. The aircraft handled exactly like her father's old plane, with the same solid feel and responsive controls. For a brief moment, she could imagine that 810965 had somehow been repaired and returned to service. During the flight, Sarah performed a flyover of the small Texas town where her father had grown up. Colonel Martinez was now retired and living in the same house where he had dreamed of becoming a pilot as a young boy. Sarah waggled the wings of 810966 as she passed over her childhood home, knowing her father would be watching from the backyard. After landing, Sarah spent several hours talking with the maintenance crew about the aircraft's service history. She learned that 810966 had flown combat missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other conflicts around the world. Like its sister ship, the aircraft had served with distinction in every theater where American forces had been deployed. The following week, 810966 made its final flight to the aircraft storage facility in the Arizona desert. Sarah was not the pilot for that last mission, but she watched from the ground as another piece of aviation history disappeared into retirement. The aircraft would be preserved in the dry desert air, awaiting possible future reactivation. 6 months later, Sarah received unexpected news that would change her perspective on military aviation history. The Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio had acquired detailed records of every A-10 aircraft ever manufactured. They were creating a comprehensive database of aircraft service histories for historical preservation. The museum researchers had discovered something amazing about the 2 aircraft connected to Sarah's family. Tail numbers 810965 and 810966 had not only been built consecutively, but had also been test flown by the same pilot at the Fairchild factory. The test pilot's name was Captain Robert Martinez, Sarah's grandfather. Sarah's grandfather had died before she was born, but her father had told her stories about the old pilot's career. Captain Martinez had served as a test pilot for several aircraft manufacturers before retiring from the Air Force in the 1980s. He had flown the first flights of dozens of military aircraft, including the 2 A-10s that would later serve his son and granddaughter. The discovery meant that 3 generations of the Martinez family had been connected to the same 2 aircraft. Sarah's grandfather had first flown both planes during their factory acceptance tests. Her father had flown 810965 in combat during the Gulf War. Sarah herself had flown both aircraft during her own military career. The Air Force Museum invited Sarah to participate in a special ceremony honoring the service of the Martinez family and their connection to military aviation history. The event would be held on the anniversary of her father's Gulf War rescue mission. Representatives from 3 generations of military pilots would be present to witness the dedication. Standing before the assembled crowd at the museum ceremony, Sarah felt the weight of her family's military legacy. She thought about her grandfather testing new aircraft fresh from the factory. She remembered her father's stories about survival behind enemy lines. She reflected on her own experiences flying combat missions over Afghanistan. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a special display case containing artifacts from both A-10 aircraft. Pieces of metal recovered from the crash site of 810965 were displayed alongside components removed from 810966 during its final maintenance inspection. A plaque told the story of 3 generations of pilots and their connection to these historic aircraft. Sarah's young son attended the ceremony wearing a miniature Air Force uniform. At 8 years old, he was already fascinated by airplanes and military history. Sarah watched him staring up at the A-10 display with the same wonder she had felt as a child, listening to her father's war stories. The legacy of courage and service that had begun with her grandfather would continue through future generations of the Martinez family.